Good afternoon, and thank you for attending this webinar, the first in a series of Kainos Cloud Webinars where we explore the practicalities of the cloud. This series is intended to put the hype around cloud into some sort of context by exposing some of the realities and dispelling some of the myths. Firstly, some introductions. I'm Jackie Devine and I'm facilitating today. I hope to field your questions and ensure we provide answers to those which are relevant to most of you at the end of the session. I have with me today the Kainos CTO and an experienced cloud practitioner, Tom Gray. Tom hopes to present an overview of the cloud, the realities of implementing the cloud, and what has worked and what hasn't. Also with me today, someone who can provide the insider's view, Phil Reid. Phil is going to provide some practical accounts of the cloud, which he has experienced as CIO of a number of large organizations, most recently the NSPCC. So let's get started. This session will last half an hour, and you can submit questions at any time. We will start answering these at the end of the session. First, let's hear what Tom Gray has to say about the realities of implementing the cloud.
Everyone for attending. Before we start in earnest, I'd like to take this opportunity to learn a little bit more about the attendees. So we'll have a short poll question. We'd like to understand what steps you've taken towards engaging cloud services. On your screen, you should see a number of options on the right-hand side. Could you please select the option that's most appropriate to you and then press the submit button. And we'll leave the poll open for about 20-30 seconds. Okay, we'll be closing the poll in a couple of seconds, so if you haven't answered, now's your time to get your answer in. Okay, thanks, folks. Now, in 10 minutes, we can't do much more than scratch the surface of what's happening with cloud computing. But I'd like to try and demystify some of the areas of uncertainty around cloud, give you some relevant case studies, and outline where Kainos feels caution is required. Now, every vendor or analyst will have their own spin on the cloud, depending on where they're coming from and, of course, what they're trying to sell you. But it breaks down to something like the definition on the slide. Cloud computing provides on-demand network access to a shared pool of configurable computing resources that is rapidly provisioned and released with minimum client or provider interaction. Now, some folks consider the cloud as a revolutionary innovation, and that can be very scary. However, cloud computing very much builds on the evolution of a variety of technologies like broadband, virtualization, service-oriented architectures, etc. For example, I've had a Hotmail account for about 12 years. This email is managed by the same system as millions of other users. I didn't have to install anything. My email is always accessible no matter where I am. And email from 12 years ago is still stored. And as far as I know, my email has never been accessed without my permission. Of course, if anyone wanted a discount on mail enhancement, they were very welcome to those emails. The Kainos view is that cloud computing is a logical and natural technology evolution that, used properly, can have a revolutionary impact on businesses. There will come a point where cloud isn't as visible as it is now, not because it has disappeared, but because it has faded into the background fabric of an organization's technology environment. Just like the internet, in fact. And like the internet, we ignore it at our peril. So looking at some of the characteristics of the cloud in a little more detail, cloud services should be elastic. If the load on a cloud service increases, you shouldn't have to worry about whether you'll run out of disk space or memory. The service should just adjust to your needs as required. With cloud, the emphasis isn't on buying or leasing tin. We're not dealing with servers or software. We're dealing with business services. Remember the Salesforce.com no software marketing campaign? You weren't buying software from them. You were buying a CRM service. Cloud services should be purchasable with minimal interaction with the provider. If you have to talk to a human, it's not cloud. There may be good reasons why you may wish to talk to a human, but you shouldn't be forced to. And of course, there's the pay-as-you-use model. Your usage of cloud services can be monitored, controlled, and reported on, providing transparency to both provider and consumer. And pay-as-you-use is proving to be a great catalyst for innovation, removing a high barrier to entry for trialing new services. You don't need to invest in a bunch of servers to get a service off the ground. Buy a cloud service, pay a small amount when demand is low, and as load increases, hopefully due to the success of the service, you just pay for additional capacity. If things don't work out, just turn it off and stop paying. So let's look at two examples of cloud in action. We'll look at EasyJet and how they make provision for growth, and how the Queensland government handled a catastrophe. We all know EasyJet, a very successful high-growth company. In fact, over the past 10 years, they have grown 20% per year. They have an all-Microsoft technology environment and have set a target for 100% uptime. And they must ensure that their technology enables this growth and doesn't constrain it. They had been deploying 100% more capacity than they needed to provide for this, and this obviously wasn't sustainable. Given their commitment to the Microsoft environment, EasyJet chose the Azure platform. And in addition to scalability and availability characteristics, the use of common Microsoft technology allowed EasyJet to extend their existing applications over Azure. They didn't replace the on-premises platform, but they complemented it. And this is important. For most organizations, cloud isn't an either-or proposition. Cloud computing will sit side by side with existing platforms, and you need to choose your cloud partners accordingly. In addition, EasyJet are starting to mobile-enable their check-in service. They originally thought they would have to invest in a new data center to run this service. However, Azure gave them a lower-cost option to trial the concept. This is cloud computing enabling innovation in a cost-effective way. Interestingly, it looks as if Apple are using Azure to pilot its iCloud service for presumably the same reasons. In December 2010, Queensland was hit by catastrophic flooding. The government mobilized immediately to provide aid, and one of the approaches they used was a telethon. They anticipated a huge spike in online donations and felt their existing solution could not support this. Also, the replacement had to be live in 48 hours. This was challenging but necessary, and this felt like a perfect cloud scenario. And yes, I do see the irony, cloud flooding, etc. Queensland worked with Heroku, a Ruby-based cloud platform, and took advantage of the ability to instantly provision a highly scalable service. They didn't have to worry about servers or specifications. They just launched the donation service and allowed the Heroku platform to scale based on demand. They collected $3 million during the telethon, and the service is still running under much lower load and correspondingly lower cost. And when it's no longer required, it can simply be switched off with nothing more to pay. People obviously focus on cloud's ability to scale up to handle high load. However, the ability to be turned off when not needed is equally important. Now, as another quick Heroku example, Kainos ran a camp for students over the summer where we taught them to build iPhone applications. We used Heroku to provide any back-end web services required. Again, the web services were built in a few days with no cost to us or the student to pilot. And the app on screen is a tidal information app for sailors and divers, and was created by a clever student called Stuart McKee. It's probably worth mentioning that the Heroku platform, which Salesforce.com recently bought, is a Ruby platform. Ruby is a very productive development language, but if you start developing on a Ruby platform like Heroku, you can't move your applications directly to a platform that doesn't support Ruby. So watch out for vendor lock-in. Today, there is no one standard cloud platform. And a few other things you should bear in mind as you start your cloud journey. There's the perception that cloud services are cheap, and that's not always the case. They are typically cheap to pilot, and the cost of getting started may be lower than a traditional software license purchase. But a reasonable monthly fee times the number of users in your organization times 36 months can really mount up over 3 years. And let's not forget the ancillary costs. Unless the cloud service addresses a very self-contained need, you'll want to integrate this with your corporate data and services. This is no different to an on-premise solution. Things like data mapping, transformations, integration buses are all still required. And there's more. Cloud services typically get updated automatically, often 2 to 3 times a year. You, as a user, have no control over that schedule and no option to decline the update. The vendor will guarantee the integrity of functionality, but will take no responsibility for any bespoke integration you may have done. You'll therefore need to run regression tests regularly. Security concerns are probably the most important obstacle to public cloud adoption, along with concerns related to regulatory compliance and data governance. However, public cloud risk can be managed like any other risk. It requires vendors, users, auditors, and governments to cooperate, a process that has started but is likely to be slow-moving. Now, cloud providers will assert that they are at least as secure as most internal data centers, and there's certainly some truth in this, at least as far as physical security is concerned. However, public clouds tend not to have particularly strong authentication and encryption capabilities. They also use technologies such as virtualization, identity federation, and API security, which will need to mature and require better standards. So, it's a manageable risk, but a risk nonetheless. And of course, you need to choose your technologies carefully. I was at the Cloud Expo conference in New York in June, and it felt like the internet land grab all over again. There were a lot of clever, well-funded small companies trying to carve out a piece of the action. And I know that next year, 80% of them just won't exist. Players like Microsoft, Dell, Rackspace, and Workday are pretty safe bets, but you need to apply the same level of due diligence and rigor to procuring cloud services as you do with traditional technology. The danger is the maverick with the credit card. You need a structured adoption plan like the one on the slide, which covers all the unsexy topics like technology alignment, organizational readiness, vendor analysis, change management, etc. It isn't as much fun as just whipping out your credit card, but you'll be grateful that you did it. So before we go any further, I think it's time for another poll. We're interested... Is that the right poll question? Here we go. Yes. Apologies, technology was lagging a little bit. We're interested in understanding what concerns you most when selecting a cloud provider. Is it the provider's capability? Does the solution meet all your requirements? Is it reliability? Is it value? Is it vendor lock-in, integration, interoperability, security, data resiliency, or the deployment model? So we'll leave the question up for about another 30 seconds. So please select the option that you feel most suits your requirements and hit submit. Okay, we're closing the poll in a few more seconds, so if you haven't answered, answer now. Okay, and the poll is closed. So, to wrap up my section, IT service provision and consumption is constantly evolving, and cloud computing is on the main evolutionary branch. The details may change, but existing IT best practice remains very relevant in a cloud environment. For most organizations, cloud computing is not a replacement for existing on-premise investments. It will be an extension or complement. This isn't all or nothing. You can and should gently trial cloud services. Don't just focus on cost savings, doing what you currently do, only cheaper. Look for opportunities to create value that weren't previously available. The low cost of piloting a service can foster innovation. Try services and ideas. If they don't work for you, just turn them off. Not all organizations are at the same level of maturity in their ability to make best use of the cloud. Assess your readiness, both from a technology and organization perspective. You don't have to jump in with both feet, but do start thinking about how you could benefit when you're ready. Start talking with key stakeholders in your organization and your technology partners. In particular, there is a view that cloud allows the business to bypass the IT department. I really wouldn't advise it, although I guess I would say that. But IT are best placed to assist with architecture, governance, integration, the stuff that maybe we'd prefer didn't exist but does for very good reasons. And most importantly, pilot applications and services. Cloud makes this much, much easier to do than had previously been possible. A well-planned pilot will help guide your thinking about the cloud opportunity and helps you judge your own readiness for the cloud. So it's time for me to hand over to Phil. Phil, you have the con.
Tom, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. What I'm going to talk about is one specific example of using the cloud for a specific application, a specific business need that demonstrates how well it can be used sometimes. First of all, some background. The NSPCC, the National Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Children, is the premier children's charity. It's probably very well known. It's probably even more well known for some of its services, especially something like Childline, which is pretty famous these days. It provides, amongst other things, it provides lots of key services to children at risk, and there are a lot of children at risk, and to the organisations that support the benefit for children. So the NSPCC works with other organisations as well as providing its own services, and a lot of that work is about the education of children, the education of parents, and the education of others to understand what those risks are and how they can be sometimes avoided and sometimes actually removed. And one of the ways that the NSPCC has always done this work, but is really gearing up far more now, is working with all primary schools, because children at the ages of 5 through to 11 are very impressionable, but at the same time learn massively quickly. So, background and numbers in terms of what drove the business requirement. There are slightly over 21,000 primary schools in the UK, and the aim is that the NSPCC would send someone to visit each school at least every 2 years. And those people would primarily be volunteers who are trained in what they should be talking about and what they should be understanding. So, for example, they would spend a whole day at the school, they would take a whole lot of educational material with them, they would talk to teachers, talk to other staff, and talk to the children. And there are occasions, have been in the past, where they have identified children at risk just through some of those conversations. And that's one of the key things that the society attempts to find out. Whenever it does anything, it's still looking for it to make sure that it can identify children at risk. So the arithmetic works out that essentially every day 53 schools need to be visited, and that's a fairly large number. And to achieve achieve that requires a volunteer force of around about 4,000 plus. So you begin to see that this is actually a fairly serious system that has to be managed. So, what does the system have to do? It's got to maintain up-to-date list of all the schools and the staff, plus some basic data about the school, such as its address. Otherwise, the volunteer doesn't know where to go. It's got to contain some basic visit scheduling capability and some visit management capability. So, it will tell the volunteer what to expect. It then has to have the ability for the volunteer to update the system with what happened on that visit. And amongst other things, it also creates a sort of a managed repository for collateral. By collateral, I mean posters, toys, and some volunteers have been known to carry very large teddy bears around with them as well. They are very, very useful for demonstrating some of the things that they're talking about. And then underneath all of that, there's a need for management reporting capability so that the senior management in the NSPCC know how useful and how effective these visits are becoming. Excuse me. Now, how did we build the system, or what the approach was? We had a target of trying to get something up and running in about 4 months. The decision we made was to build that in Microsoft Dynamics using essentially CRM technology, and that brought us straight into which way should we do this? Should we build it in-house, or should we use a cloud solution? Now, essentially the system requirements were simple, and all of them could be resolved without us having to customize the software, which is always very useful. And that meant that those two options were actually available to us. But we did do a fairly detailed review of the costs and the risks. And what we identified was that even with the major discounting that charities get from Microsoft, in the first couple of years, the cloud solution was cheaper. And because of the type of service level we needed, could be effective. Should we need something more difficult to achieve, something like a 24/7 service, then maybe we might have thought somewhere else, but it doesn't require anything like that. However, in terms of cost, even with that discounting, an in-house-based solution becomes more cost-effective after around about year 2. And that's because essentially it's a cost per seat, and that just keeps going year after year. When on the other hand, once you've bought your license, then you can keep that going for quite a few number of years, probably even longer if you decide not to upgrade the software. So our decision came out to, because we needed the system up and running very quickly and we didn't think we'd keep it that long, we actually went for the cloud solution. That was the background to the solution, the solution that we looked for. In terms of how we did it, well, we used Kainos, because they were a well-known supplier to the society and have a very deep background in resourcing and skills in Microsoft Dynamics, which for us was crucial. There are a number of companies around that claim skills in Dynamics, but we'd already had some fairly nasty experiences. And the other reason was that Kainos had worked with society in many major projects, including the famous one of Childline, where we had a year in which to rebuild the system completely. That's essentially what I was going to talk about in terms of how the society used cloud and how it used CRM and Dynamics for what was quite not a difficult project, but something that had to be done very, very quickly. Obviously, we're available to take all sorts of questions, so thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Phil. We're going to have our final poll question here. It's poll question 3. And the question is, what advantages do you think your organization gains or could gain from using the cloud? Possible responses are going to come up, hopefully, shortly. Yep. The main one, I suppose, that most people think is saving money or saving on costs. Others, saving time and development and support effort. The third being better access to your data from anywhere. Fourth being fixed budget, so knowing what your monthly payments are going to be. And finally, that it's affordable, because many cloud services are free or of low cost. So if you could respond to us now, that would be great. We'll close the poll in about 15 seconds. We are getting questions coming through, but I thought it would be of interest to know what the answers were to the 2 poll questions previously. 48% of people who responded were currently investigating opportunities and risks, and about a quarter of you are either piloting or actually using applications on the cloud. And no big surprises on poll question 2 about your concerns. 20% of you said you were concerned about security, and 14% on the value of the cloud service, slightly less on the integration problems that it may pose, and then 9% of you on the capability of the cloud offering. So no real big surprises there, I suppose, mainly security. Regarding questions, I can see we've really only got 1 minute left, so I will just address one of the questions that's come through. One of the questions is addressed to Tom. Tom, you raised the topic surrounding security and data residency. How do I know where my data is to ensure that I am not in breach of any data protection laws? So, Tom, could you give us your thoughts on that?
In 1 minute. Well chosen, Jackie, because that kind of ties into the majority interest in security. Given the way the question was asked, it sounds like the person who posed the question is aware that the responsibility for data residency sits firmly with the business or the organization as opposed to the provider of the cloud service. And at the moment, the answer is actually pretty straightforward. Simply ask the provider where the data will be stored. If the vendor can't provide a satisfactory and definitive answer, just look for another provider. And in Kainos recently, we had a client with a requirement for an infrastructure as a service solution, but the data could not, under any circumstances, leave the EU territory. And we identified a provider who could guarantee that under no circumstances would the data leave the UK shores, and that satisfied the data residency requirement. So, as with the areas that I highlighted at the start, there's a lot more to choosing a cloud solution than just picking up your credit card and buying it. All the areas around data governance and data security need to be handled with good corporate IT governance best practice in mind.
Thank you, Tom. We've run out of time. There were a few questions that we didn't get back to. We won't be able to get back to you now, but we can get back to you shortly. And there is a recording of this webinar which will appear on our website shortly. As mentioned, this is the first in a series of webinars on the cloud, and we will tailor content based on the responses to the poll questions that we've received. I really hope you find the session useful, and I want to thank Tom and Phil for their contributions, and most importantly, you for registering and participating in this event. Please keep an eye on our website for future events, and of course you can contact us via email at any time if you want to find out anything more from our cloud experts. Many thanks for attending, and good afternoon.